welcome back for Chapter 7. On his final rounds of the evening of October 26th, Dr. Kaashan, the chief pediatric resident at Wendell General, noted the following on the chart of Abby McNeil. 2352, temp, 99 PO. Point A and OX3, but still uncommunicative. Persists without sensation distally. Which, in translation, meant that at 8 minutes to midnight, Abby's fever had abated to 99 degrees PO per os, Latin for by mouth, that she was alert and oriented to time, place, and person, but still could not feel anything in her extremities when Kaashan pinched them, which was, of course, consistent with a patient with a broken fourth cervical vertebrae. Kaashan freed the little girl's blonde locks where they'd gotten tangled in her metal halo, wished her good night, and left for the evening. By the morning of the 28th, when he was next on call, Abby was moving again. "I want an LCS film stat," Kaashan barked at the nearest RN as the room began filling up with pilgrims to the site of Wendell's resident miracle. At the center of the chaos, Abby lay watching with the placid eyes of a child llama. All eyes were riveted to every voluntary movement of her arms and legs as she shifted in her bed. Someone held out a Beanie Baby dolphin to her. The room fell to a hush, and then a collective gasp of amazement went out as her fingers closed around the toy. 20 minutes later, following a well-escorted trip to the X-ray suites, Kaashan stood examining Abby's LCS, lateral cervical spine, films on a light box. "Holy shit," he heard himself say. Nearby, someone gave a low whistle. The little girl's cervical fracture was healing like no broken neck Kaashan had ever seen before. A strange pattern of ossification was knitting the fracture together again. But it was more than simple healing. It almost seemed like reinforcing. Weird spiny growths were linking transverse and articular processes of the vertebrae, clustering like armored barnacles along the spine. The new bone showed in the murky films as hot spots. The little girl's spinal column, viewed in sections across the light box, lit up like a Christmas tree, and within that armored column they could assume an equally miraculous and impossible regeneration was underway. "We'd better get a consult from osteo and urology," Kaashan said, and then added for good measure, and maybe an orthopod and a couple PTs. He'd recently turned 30, had graduated first in his medical school class, and was generally considered something of a medical prodigy. But in his 30 years, he'd also developed a keen sense of when he was in over his head. And looking at the little girl's x-rays now, he knew that time had arrived. Shortly after Wendy reported to work at the Crystal Path, her boss, Alyssa, told her she wanted to go in back to perform her morning vinyasa, the vigorous series of postures and breathing exercises known as a vinyasa had the unusual quality of being more strenuous and aerobic the more accomplished a yogi one became. "How's business this morning?" Wendy inquired before her boss retired to the back room and her yoga mat. "Mostly tourists," Alyssa said. "No true believers." She almost made it sound like a weather forecast. "Mostly tourists with a slight chance of true believers." Tourists were often better for business than the true believers. True believers mostly came in to replenish perishables like candles or herbs or incense. Tourists, once they got beyond the gaping stage, were likely to purchase the more expensive trinkets on what Alyssa called travel whims. The feeling that they might never come this way again and didn't want to regret not shelling out a few extra dollars for that one-of-a-kind, handmade silver pendant. It was for that very reason that Alyssa never put out duplicate items of jewelry. The local craftsman who turned out most of the work was indeed making handmade items, but they were so identical as to be all but indistinguishable from one another by anyone but the craftsman himself. Still, there was no deception in advertising when she placed the handmade original cards in front of the various pieces. The priciest items in the display cases even came with a certificate of authenticity, signed by the artist or craftsman. Every little bit of marketing and showmanship was needed to move them, but Alyssa displayed these items under consignment, so she never had to employ high-pressure sales tactics to foist them on anyone. Still, the Crystal Path could expect a slight boom of business in the week before Halloween, as that holiday was its retail substitute for a traditional store's Christmas season. Tourists would be more inclined to buy the various trappings of modern witchcraft now than during any other time of the year. The mood was just right for a little supernatural extravagance, and the Wendell business community sure put on a show around Halloween, decorating windows and signs, stringing banners across power lines announcing the upcoming King Frost costume parade. Almost every business worth its marketing salt was giving out black hat coupons or broomstick bargains or Fright Night specials. The used car salesman on television was the worst, selling beat-up Buicks to a costumed hag witch who was trading in her broken broomstick. The lingerie shops used sexy witches in scantily clad outfits to move their enchanted and bewitching nightwear. Your man will be spellbound. Dating service witch counselors turned frogs into princes. Even commercials for the state lottery featured crystal-gazing witches trying to forecast the lucky numbers. In other words, Wendy's gag reflex was working overtime. Another hazard of growing up in Wendell was the near-constant bombardment of ridiculous witch caricatures, and no time of the year was worse than the week leading up to Halloween. Even though the holiday marked Samhain, a most important day on the witch's calendar, that's when Wendy felt the most misunderstood. In light of her recent squabbles with Frankie and Alex, she felt depressed and more alone than she ever did before. Frankie had left 3 telephone messages with Wendy's mom to Alex's 1. Wendy had returned none of them, which drove her mother about as crazy as when she ignored a ringing telephone. People simply returned telephone calls. It was the polite thing to do. Wendy had just said, "If you aren't speaking to someone, isn't the telephone rather superfluous?" The 4 oversized palmistry hands at the corners of the cash register island seemed disgustingly festive, and Wendy fought the urge to rip them off their suction-cupped springs and toss them under the next street cleaner to pass by. Hitting them was no good, since they just wobbled back and forth in their "Hi there, see ya" waves. She had no boxes to uncrate, so she took the synthetic feather duster and walked to the shelf filled with crystal balls, where she began to touch up their stands. The last one rested on the coiled silver dragon. She held the crystal ball in one hand while she dusted the dragons with the other. The door chimes clinked together just as she was about to return the crystal sphere to the serpent's coils. Wendy turned and looked up as an elderly man wearing a rumpled black suit coat entered the store. Her gaze met his, and he said, "Witch!" The face belonged to Jonah Cook, the lecherous magistrate she had dreamed about and had seen murdered by Rebecca Cole. Wendy gasped and her fingers went numb, losing their grip on the crystal ball, which struck the floor with a sound like a faraway gong and shattered at her feet. She backed into the shelving and almost dislodged several more crystal balls from their ornamental pedestals. "Sorry to startle you, young lady," the old man said. "I was just wondering, which way is it to the interstate? I'm from out of town and a little lost." Wendy pointed to the east, the lump still too large in her throat to permit her to speak. Her heart hammered so strongly she felt the crystal pendant on her chest vibrating in a sympathetic rhythm. "Do you need some help cleaning up that glass?" the man asked. Alyssa stepped beside Wendy, her slippered feet shuffling to avoid the jagged shards of crystal scattered across the floor. "That's okay, sir. We'll take care of it." The man nodded and backed out of the store with another mumbled apology. Wendy stared after him, deciding the resemblance to Cook had mostly been a trick of the light and shadows cast by the spider ferns. "Wendy?" "I'm okay, I think," Wendy said. "He just surprised me. He looked like somebody I've seen before." "Where?" "In one of my dreams," Wendy said. "A frightening man." "So you are still having these strange dreams," Alyssa said with a clear hint of accusation. Wendy had made the mistake of telling Alyssa that she hadn't had the dreams anymore in the past several days. No sense complaining about it if Alyssa couldn't help her do anything about it. Now and then, Wendy said, I'm trying to not let them bother me. Obviously, they are bothering you, Alyssa said. You need to relax. You need to remove the stress points from your life. Wendy told Alyssa that she'd had fights with both Frankie and Alex without going into the specific circumstances of the ritual. Definitely stress points, Alyssa said. You need to resolve these issues to remove the stress from your life. I thought they were my friends, Wendy said, but they think I'm a freak, just like everyone else. Who needs them? I'm guessing you do, Gwendolyn, Alyssa said. Wendy started to respond, but Alyssa held up her hand. Listen to me for a minute. People you let close to you, inside your social circle, if you will, are going to get curious about your lifestyle. They're bound to get curious. You have to make allowances for that. I know that, but if you're holding them up to normal average standards of curiosity, they are going to let you down, Alyssa said. I bet they're not even sure how to phrase the first question about what you do. Frankie asks plenty of questions, but I bet she's not even aware of how seriously you take this stuff. To her, it probably seems like an interesting lark, a different way to be mysterious. She doesn't see your attempts to connect to nature, to commune with nature and the elements. In a way, both of them probably can't see beyond the cartoons cluttering this town or the darker mysteries surrounding witchcraft. So what am I supposed to do about it? Alyssa smiled wryly. You have two choices. You can be alone for the rest of your life and mope, or you can talk to them, explain what it all means to you. How else will they ever understand? Grudgingly, Wendy began to see the wisdom of Alyssa's assessment. Maybe it wasn't fair of her to judge them by the usual standards. Maybe it was up to her to cut them some slack. She thought it over while she swept the remains of the dragon crystal into a dustbin. She promised to reimburse Alyssa in weekly installments out of her paycheck each week for the next month. By the time she had the floor completely clean, she had decided to give Frankie a call to apologize. As she reached for the telephone, it rang beneath her hand. Crystal Path? Wendy said into the receiver. Perhaps you can help me, said an old woman's voice. I need the ingredients for a spell. A spell? Wendy asked skeptically. Crank calls were all too common this time of year. A fake voice? Yes, the old woman said. A forgiveness spell. It seems I misjudged a situation involving two young lovers. Frankie? Wendy asked, smiling. The name is Frances, my dear, the old woman's voice said. Frances Jane Leonard. Frankie, Wendy exclaimed. I'm glad you called. You are? Normal, squeaky Frankie voice now. Why? Wendy laughed. Because I've been a stubborn jackass. But you're all better now? I'm okay, Wendy said, feeling a weight lifting from her back. Better than fine. You got laid? Laughing. No. Well, you sound like you just had some good sex, woman. Speaking of sex, are you also fine with Mr. Dunkirk? Yes. No. I mean, I haven't called him yet. Well, you should. Call him, I mean, Frankie said. Guys who wear sunglasses and Hawaiian shirts really shouldn't mope. I have his dorm number, Wendy said. I can try him there. Want to split a pizza later? During your break? I have this intense mozzarella craving. Okay, bring a pizza in an hour, Wendy said, laughing. Make it a large, Alyssa said, returning from the back room again. No meat toppings. Hold the meat, Wendy said into the phone, then to Alyssa. What about cheese? I thought you were becoming a vegan. I haven't made the total commitment yet, Alyssa said, but I'm leaning. Wendy spoke into the receiver. Make that one large, leaning tower of pizza. Oh, you are shameless, Alyssa chuckled. I should dock your pay for that pun. Bye, Frankie. See you in 60, Wendy said, hung up the telephone, then dialed Alex's dorm number. It rang 9 times, and she was about to hang up when the ringing stopped. After a moment, Alex's sleepy voice said, Hello, over the receiver. Alex, it's Wendy. Immediately, he seemed more alert, but still tentative. Wendy, hi. Good to hear your voice again. I was just dozing. Been a long day. Feel like I stepped in another cow. Stepped in what? Never did get to tell you about the cow, did I? Maybe later, Wendy said. Maybe he'd been drinking. I just wanted to find out if you're still curious. Curious? Yes, I am. Why? I have some things I want to show you. white Jetta pulled off onto the shoulder of Route 33, and Sheriff Bill Nottingham looked up from his grim task of securing off a corner of a weedy utility ditch with "Police Do Not Cross" tape. Eric Beauregard, a local freelancer who pinch hit as a crime scene photographer on those rare occasions Wendell had a scene worth documenting, climbed out of the car with the cardboard carryall from the Witch's Brew House on Main. "Got you a mochaccino and everything bagel," Beauregard said, setting the carryall on the hood of his car and walking over toward the ditch, at the bottom of which lay a greasy heap that not so very long ago had been a human being, or more accurately, part of one. There wasn't much left to identify the victim, which made looking at the mess, part of a torso, according to the medical examiner, that much easier for those who had to deal with it. Missing head, hands, limbs, and any other distinguishing characteristics, it had been dehumanized to the point of roadkill. Except that this roadkill had had a name at some point within the last 6 to 12 hours. Determining that name was the sheriff's business, and there were beginning to be several candidates. This morning he'd arrived at his office to find a waiting room of concerned family members wanting to file missing persons reports. First, there was Lottie Brown reporting her husband, Larry, missing. An electrician by trade, Larry had last been seen working late into the night stringing lights along Main in anticipation of the King Frost Parade. Then there was Jessie Burke, a pretty junior at Danfield, concerned that her roommate, Tina, hadn't come home after spending the evening cramming for a poli-science exam at the library. And there were 70-something-year-old Florence Reeder, whose equally elderly gentleman friend, George, had never returned from one of his late-night insomniac strolls with their Boston Terrier, J. Edgar, though Florence had found the dog sleeping peacefully on the front stoop that morning, still wearing its leash. By Wendell's sleepy standards, it was a veritable pandemic of disappearances. Compound that with the earlier drowning death of Jack Carter, his girlfriend's talk of monsters, and the rash of vandalism, and the sheriff was beginning to feel a sick little knot of dread just below his breastbone. What the fuck was happening to his town? "Any idea who it is?" Eric Beauregard asked, beginning to snap photos from varying angles. "No idea," the sheriff said, "though I can tell you who I wish it was." Personally, he hoped it was Art Leeson, the fugitive he'd spent every waking hour of the last 3 days tracking. He had a hunch, though, that he wouldn't be so lucky to have that manhunt end here so easily, in a drainage ditch beside an old snow route. The sheriff's instincts were serving him well. The human remains did not belong to Art Leeson, or, for that matter, Larry Brown, Tina Lewis, or George Gertz. In fact, they belonged to a drifter, but this piece of information would never be determined, and Christopher Perry would find himself interred eternally and eventually forgotten within a storage drawer at the Essex County Medical Examiner's office. Wendy had fallen asleep sitting up in bed, a sure sign of her general fatigue. Her teeth were chattering and her skin was covered with goose flesh. "Why am I so cold?" she wondered. Her forehead was hot and damp. It took a few moments for the fog of sleep to lift before she realized that her dark fingernails had clawed through her biology workbook, shredding lessons for the rest of the semester along with some of her blankets. Remnants of chapter summaries were scattered on her bed like confetti. Then she saw the blood and began clearing away the paper and shredded cloth to reveal the 3 slices she'd gouged in her thigh. That's when she realized her leg wasn't just stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. It ached from the wound. She hobbled to the bathroom, poured a palmful of hydrogen peroxide over the cuts, then taped a gauze bandage the size of a coaster tight against her thigh, splashed water in her face, grimaced at the few gray hairs that had popped up recently in her dark hair. Evidence of lack of sleep? Yet she had fallen asleep, if only for a few minutes, and without preparing for dream magic. No valerian, no moonstone or amethyst. Before she fell asleep that night, she'd had to remember to put on that old pair of leather driving gloves she had in the garage to sheath her claws. This dream had been of the simple being chased variety, except the thing chasing her was some sort of dark, looming boogeyman, and it had the same hideous leathery face she had seen briefly in her mirror all over Jensen Hoyt's dorm walls. She vaguely recalled trying to scrabble over a stone fence to escape, which was probably when her hands and her fingernails had lashed out. But this dream had affected her differently, completely draining her. Maybe because she was unprepared. Her sliced thigh alone was enough reason not to fall asleep again without the preparations. A glance at her clock radio told her she was running late for her 2 afternoon classes, after which she'd have time to visit Professor Glazier during her posted office hours. Her thigh wound had stopped throbbing in time to her heartbeat midway through her second and last class of the afternoon, so Wendy decided to skip the elevator ride and climb the stairs to the 4th floor of Pearson on principle alone. In addition to the new gray hairs she'd found before going to her afternoon classes, the circles under her eyes were well on their way to becoming bags. She had even borrowed some of her mother's makeup and expertise to make her eyes appear a little less frightful, enduring her mother's clucks of disapproval on how she was wasting her youth. Despite a slight pause on the 3rd floor landing, Wendy finally made it to the 4th floor Pearson. A little breathless, she admitted to herself, and a little wobbly in the pins, but here all the same. 4th floor was where most of the liberal arts profs had their offices. Wendy was looking for room 424. She was ticking off the room numbers, only peripherally aware of the man mopping the floor until he called out to her, "Be careful!" Startled, she turned and looked back at him. "What?" "The floor," he said, pointing. "It's still wet down there." "Oh, the floor," she said, feeling idiotic. "Thanks. I'll watch my step." He probably thought she was being a wise-ass, but lately concentrating on 2 things at once required more focus than she could muster. Checking door numbers and watching her step? She might as well attempt to walk and chew gum at the same time. Absurd, Wendy thought, then giggled to herself. I am becoming frighteningly delirious all too easily these days. She found the door to 424 open, but knocked lightly on the doorframe nonetheless. No answer. She poked her head in. 3 small offices in the room, with nameplates beside the doors. Teresa Renzetti and Anthony J. Zambino flanked Professor Glazier's middle office. Wendy stepped into the outer office waiting area, which featured 2 chairs and a narrow table cluttered with all sorts of cautionary pamphlets and a couple of academic journals. The doors to the Renzetti and Zambino offices were closed and, based on the dark vertical panels of frosted glass beside them, unoccupied as well. Professor Glazier's door was open, and she was sitting at her desk, elbow planted on an uneven pile of blue books, her chin resting in the curled palm of her hand. Wendy thought she might have dozed off and worried that her prof might fall into another seizure. "Professor Glazier?" Wendy called softly. Karen startled slightly, making Wendy believe she really had fallen into a light sleep. She looked up, and her eyes seemed a little worn around the edges as well, from stress or lack of sleep. "Hi," Professor Glazier said. "Sorry, I must have dozed off. Come in. What can I do for you?" "Nothing, actually," Wendy said, and saw the look of confusion on Professor Glazier's face. "I brought you something." She opened her purse and took out a small linen pouch, which rustled when she handled it and resembled a dollhouse pillow. It had a little cloth strap dangling from it. "I was going to give it to you after class the other day, but I chickened out." She found herself inexplicably nervous. "You may have heard some things about me, that I dabble in white magic." "I've heard rumors," Professor Glazier said diplomatically. "I bet. Anyway, this is a charm I made for your baby-to-be and for you. It's mostly parsley, sage, and rosemary with a turquoise stone for good luck. The seeds and leaves are supposed to bring beauty, health, vitality." As she began to run down the list of attributes, she saw Professor Glazier's eyes drift off somewhere far away, and judging by the tears that began to well up, it wasn't a very nice place. Wendy stopped abruptly and reached to put a hand on Karen's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Karen's eyes were filled with sadness. "No," she said quietly. "No, I'm not." Wendy hesitated, unsure of whether or not she was being invited to intrude further into personal terrain. She decided to take a chance. "Is it the baby?" Karen nodded and said with finality, "I'm losing her." Wendy felt her professor's words like a sudden sharp blow to the chest. She felt something catch within her own throat in sympathy. Karen looked embarrassed, began searching her desk for tissues. "I'm sorry. I'm sure you didn't come here to listen to me. It's okay, really." Karen found a crumpled packet of Kleenex and blew her nose loudly. 15 years I've been teaching, and I've never broken down in front of a student," she announced it more like as a criticism than an explanation. "I've just been such a wreck lately. I can't eat without getting sick, can't sleep without having nightmares." Wendy fixed on Karen's last words. "Nightmares?" And despite a long-held personal belief that teachers should maintain a professional distance from their students, Karen found herself confessing to Wendy about her dreams of Rebecca Cole. Wendy listened without expression, nodding on occasion as Karen described the lucid tour of Colonel Wendell, Colonial Wendell, the leering gaze of Jonah Cook, the epileptic seizure, and Wither. As she listened, she tried not to let her face reveal the sinking feeling blooming like a black flower in her stomach. But despite her best efforts at composure, when Karen finished, Wendy was reeling. "Wendy, what's wrong?" "I'm sorry. I know it's not fair to vent my problems on you." "No," Wendy said sharply. "I deserve this. I deserve to know what I've set loose," she thought, though she couldn't bring herself to admit this aloud to Karen. She stood suddenly and took her professor's hand in her own. "I'm going to stop this, Karen," she said. "I'm going to stop your nightmares. Our nightmares." She gave Karen's hand a squeeze and hoped she took some little bit of strength from Wendy's grasp. She hoped, too, that she didn't sound as frightened as she felt inside as she made the promise. It had to stop. Whatever plague of nightmares she'd set loose during that ceremony in the woods had to be put back into the Pandora's box from which they'd come, before they wreaked any more havoc, before they snatched any more innocence like Jack Carter, before they invaded any more dreams, before they sapped Wendy's remaining strength and she was no longer able to fight them. But how do you reseal Pandora's box? How do you trick the vicious genie back into his bottle? Still holding Karen's hand, Wendy looked out the window of the office at the gathering night. God only knew what was waiting out there for her, or what it wanted with this poor pregnant woman, but Wendy was going to find out. She had an idea, but it would require Alex's complete understanding and his help. Karen wore the strange charm Wendy had given her close to her heart throughout the afternoon's blur of colorless events, slipped into an inner pocket of her cardigan like a secret valentine. Periodically she would take out the charm and study it, holding the fragrant little pouch to her nose. Like the tea-soaked Madeleine that released the floodgates of nostalgia in Proust's masterwork, Remembrance of Things Past, a novel Karen team taught with Deb Schaefer from the Modern Languages Department, the witch charm's scent of sage and rosemary conjured up for Karen a series of warm memories of the day she first told Paul she was pregnant, of an afternoon spent picking wallpaper for the nursery, of the evening she'd first felt the baby kick. The charm and the memories it evoked seemed to break something resistant within her, some tiny seal with which she'd been holding grief at bay. All throughout this horrible week she'd tried to safeguard her heart by avoiding these memories of happier times, knowing that they would be corrosive in their undiluted purity. But she was too tired now to resist any longer. Wendy's charm, for better or worse, had convinced her of that. When she pulled into her garage, she closed her eyes and listened to the ticking of her cooling engine, finally allowing the grief to flood the inner recesses she fought to preserve, and, unexpectedly, found herself relieved. She'd expected it to be like the moment when a drowning victim can no longer hold their breath and gives herself to the water. But it was not. As she gave herself to her grief, it ceased to be an infinite thing. ceased to be the vast and life-smothering blackness she'd feared, and became instead something finite, already lightening at its borders, something that could be endured, something that could be survived. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw with greater clarity now the Volvo's speckled windshield in need of washing, the cluttered garage in need of cleaning, spring projects after a long winter. She felt a strange melodic calm, and far beneath it a counterpart melancholy, barely audible now, only a resonant hum. It was the aggregate sound, she imagined, of microscopic healing. Thank you, Wendy, she thought. She got out of the car and headed inside with the takeout roast chicken and stuffing she'd bought for herself and the fugitive she was harboring. Art? She called, entering the house. Hey, he said, coming across the kitchen toward her. Any luck on the net? She asked. She'd left him this morning working at her laptop and modem with an old paisley handkerchief tied across his eye. That made him look like a digital age buccaneer. He relieved her of the burden of the takeout bag. No, I couldn't get access to any county records online, and you can't exactly do a Yahoo search for town curses. He was just removing the styrofoam containers from the bag when the doorbell rang. They both froze, turning in the direction of the sound. Who is it? Art asked Karen in a frightened whisper. I don't know. Karen could see a man in a profile through the front door's leaded glass. She pushed Art back into the dark dining room adjacent, out of the line of sight should the visitor at the front door choose to peer in through the windows. Bracing herself for the sight of a half-dozen U.S. Marshals on the porch, she walked to the door and opened it, and found Paul. He stood shifting nervously under the porch light. They stood in silence for several heartbeats, already becoming strangers to each other after only a few days' absence. He looked tired, she thought, and she felt a sudden unexpected tug of longing for him. He hesitated on the threshold of the house, round-shouldered and vulnerable, hands thrust deep within his pockets as if he couldn't trust himself in the situation he was entering, as if he was afraid she'd turned to glass. You rang the doorbell? She said, surprised he hadn't used his key. I didn't think I should just come in, he said miserably. She opened her arms to him, and he stepped forward into her embrace. She clung to him, kissed his sunburned ears, smelled the cigarette smoke in his shaggy hair. She clung to him hard, there on the front porch, within full sight of God and all the neighbors, and for the first time she didn't care. He buried his face in her neck, and she thought he might be crying. She heard him say, I haven't slept. I thought I'd lost everyone who meant anything to me. First you, then my brother. You'd better come inside then, she finally said, breaking their embrace. There's someone here. Confusion crossed his face, but he nodded and allowed himself to be led inside by the hand. Art had been incorrect in assuming his brother would try to talk him into turning himself into the police. We've got to get you the hell out of town, Paul said. Now, tonight. I can't, Art said. They'll have notified all the bus and train stations within a 100-mile radius, and there's no way I'd make it past airport security. You can take my truck then, Paul said. You can be in Canada by morning. I can't drive, not with one eye. My depth perception is shot. He didn't say that his night vision seemed to be improving in his bad eye. Reminded of his injuries, he adjusted his handkerchief eye patch. Even this tiny bit of movement ignited a Roman candle behind the closed eyelid. At least the pain had subsided from the light shows, though. I'll drive you then, Paul said. Are you kidding? Karen said, leaning forward at the kitchen table. I'm sure the police are watching you. Paul frowned at this. They did turn my place upside down looking for Art, he said. Of course they did, Karen said. Bill Nottingham went to the school with all of us. He knows how close you are with your brother. He'll expect you to try to hide him. Paul sighed, knowing she was right. He can't stay here, though. It's only a matter of time before they come looking for him here. We've got to take a chance to sneak him out of town. Karen considered a moment, then said, If you wait until Halloween, there'll be another 20,000 tourists here for the parade. You won't be so conspicuous. Art looked at his brother across the kitchen table, and Paul nodded once. It was a plan. Art said, I've never thought I'd actually be grateful to the stupid fucking King Forest parade. He stopped abruptly at the house lights flickered he stopped abruptly as the house lights flickered suddenly and died. The house was plunged in darkness. Paul went to the window, moved the curtain so he could look out at the street. Whole neighborhood's out. Must have blown a transformer. I have candles here somewhere, Karen said, and went to a junk drawer beside the sink where she kept every misfit item she didn't want cluttering tabletops. Old batteries, picture hangers, a tack hammer, flashlight, candles. In a dozen loose varieties. Birthday, practical joke. They sputtered back to life after you blew them out. Plain white beeswax. She took out 2 squat candles the diameter of soda cans and borrowed Paul's Zippo to light them. She found herself strangely captivated by the lighter blue flame as she held it first to one wick and then the other. The second wick was stubborn, and as she struggled to get it to take the flame, she smelled the mingling scents of butane and acrid wax. And that's what triggered it. Christ, she'll swallow her tongue, Paul said as he and Art crouched beside Karen on the kitchen floor. Her eyes were rolled back in their sockets so that only the crescents of white showed beneath fluttering lids. Her convulsing limbs drummed the kitchen's linoleum. It was a tonic-clonic seizure, and as the electrical storm cascaded through her nervous system, she alternated between stiffened limbs and spasming. Art began searching for something to wedge between Karen's clenched teeth. He snatched a hand towel from the refrigerator door and stretched it tight between his hands. As he crouched down to try to wedge it like a horse's bit into her mouth, Karen suddenly froze, her face snapping toward Art. No, she barked, and her voice was gravelly and deep, a guttural sound. Art froze. In the flickering candlelight, Karen showed a horrible grin, and she fixed him with a hateful and pupilless gaze. I did not, she said again, filled with fury. Paul recoiled from her, watching her head loll from side to side as if a captive enemy of this spasming body. Finally he mustered the courage to try to approach her again. Karen, it's me. It's okay. Stay back, Art said, motioning Paul to keep his distance. They watched as Karen dragged herself backward across the linoleum, like an animal with a broken back trying to crawl to the roadside. When she reached the corner where counters came together, she pulled herself upright into a seated position and lay there with legs splayed, a feral rag doll. She glared at them, panting. Release me, she roared, and Art felt his hackles rise as he realized there was a fourth person in the room with them. Who are you? Art asked, trying to control the quaver in his voice. You know us, she said, head thrashing side to side in agony. You have accused us. Art shot a helpless glance to Paul. He began improvising, hoping if he stalled long enough the seizure would abate. I don't understand. Accused you of what? Malefic doings. Congress with the devil. Murder. Art had a flash of inspiration. State your name for the record, he shouted imperiously. Rebecca Cole, Karen shouted back at him. She'd hooked her fingers through drawer handles to either side of her and thrashed now as if manacled there. Art was glad for the delusion. Would you? Would you? She glared at him with lethal rage. She spat, catching Art on the cheek. Her saliva burned like molten wax. What's wrong with her? Paul asked as Art wiped his cheek. She thinks she's one of the Wendell witches. I don't know why. Would you? She barked at him from her corner, and when she'd gotten Art's attention again, would you send a child to your gallows? What child? I don't understand. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But what of her unborn child? She strained at her imagined manacles. Would you cast your own babe into the pit? Would you, magistrate? She pronounced the title of office with equal parts of venom and derision. Paul had inched his way toward the phone. I'm calling an ambulance, he said in a harsh whisper. We can't let this go on any longer. Art raised his hand. I have an idea how to end it. Karen had begun screaming a torrent of obscenities at them both. He picked up one of the candles and still burning on the table and held it out before him as he slid across the floor toward Karen. Her fury intensified, and dark blood began pouring from her nostrils. It stained her teeth a glistening crimson. Rebecca Cole, Art said sharply, stilling her like a thunderclap. He held the candle up, and she fixed on it, following its slow, hypnotic trajectory through the air. Rebecca Cole, you stand accused of betraying your God and murdering the innocent. Ah, whore lover, you fucking... It is... If it is Satan's embrace you cherish, then it is into Satan's arms we shall send you. I shall give thee blood to drink, she screamed, and the kitchen drawers rattled as she convulsed, the first spilling free. Art didn't back away, even as she reached for him. And so I sentence you to be hanged from the neck until dead. No! And Art blew out the candle. Instantly she slumped, going limp on the linoleum. Paul rushed to her, cradling her in his arms as she whimpered and drew herself into a fetal ball. When her eyes fluttered open moments later, she looked at them blankly. What happened to me? She asked, searching Paul's face. Where am I? Paul threw his brother a helpless look, and so Art answered for him. The 20th century. When Wendy sat down to change the gauze bandage on her thigh that night, she was amazed that the parallel row of deep cuts had almost completely healed, leaving 4 5-inch long red lines no more threatening than paper cuts. With a disbelieving shake of her head, she rolled up the bandage and tossed it in the trash can. Just as she was buttoning her black jeans, her mother knocked on her bedroom door, leaned in, and told her that Alex had arrived. Don't sound so surprised, Mom, Wendy said. Stop being so sensitive, her mother said. You are going to see him, aren't you? Yes, Mother, we reached a detente, Wendy said. Actually, I invited him over. And was she feeling a bit of stage fright now? She wanted to show him all of her magical items, try to make him understand, convince him to help her. But what if he thought all of it was ludicrous? Was she prepared for that? No holding back, she thought. No turning back. Send him up, Mom, she said. Wendy, her mother said, slipping into her cautionary mode, don't forget your father and I have that fundraiser tonight. You have the house alone for the night, so please don't make me regret it. I won't, Carol. Believe me, I won't. Don't take that tone with me, young lady. Sorry, Wendy said. I just wish you would learn to trust me. Trust has to be earned, her mother said, then nodded. Wendy rolled her eyes and sighed. A moment after her mother left, Wendy examined the scattered books and clothes, the soda cans and paper cups from a fresh perspective, and decided that some careful weeding might be in order. She picked up her trash can and quickly filled it with paper, plastic, and aluminum. A recycling sort could come later. She gathered clothing from her headboard, bookshelves, chairback, and exercise bicycle. She carried the bulky pile to her door, but heard athletically quick footfalls coming up the stairs. She'd never make it to the bathroom hamper unseen, so she turned 180 degrees and headed for her closet, wedging the wadded ball of clothes in among her shoes and trash bags full of sweaters. Knuckles rapped on her door. She kicked at the clothes, avalanching out of the closet. Just a minute, she said, forcing the door shut. Coming. She ran to her bedroom door, took what she hoped was a calming deep breath, then swung the door open. Alex stood there, smiling nervously. He was carrying a small paper bag. Come in, she said. I work better sitting in the clutter. She closed the door. Have a seat, she said, indicating the wicker chair by the window. I brought you something, he said, looking down into the bag he was carrying. I've been carrying it around most of the day. He took out a single red rose, stem cut short so it could be worn as a corsage. Guess it doesn't look so hot anymore. Discouraged, he dropped the rose back into the bag. Wendy took it from him, smiling, and carefully fastened it to her hair. She gave him a slightly awkward thank you kiss. She didn't feel it so much as experience the brief pressure, the skip of her heartbeat. Her imagination raced ahead to a time when they might be comfortable at this. Alex smiled and stumbled a bit as he sat in the chair, his eyes scanning the room, gaze resting briefly on the wooden pentagram. "So what do you think?" She tried to examine her surroundings from his perspective. Scattered magazines, a large poster of a forest view pinned to the back of her bedroom door, a nature calendar on the wall by her closet. Aside from the unusually titled books and the wall pentagram, she saw nothing really bizarre. He asked about her exercise bicycle facing the wall map of the United States, and she explained her mental journey on the bike. "Can't wait to get to the French Quarter in New Orleans," she said. "You'll probably make it to the Grand Canyon by the end of the semester," he said, chuckling. "And not one sacrificial altar in the whole mess." He took a deep breath and said, "I wasn't sure what to expect." "All of my," she was about to say, "magic," then realized how ridiculous that might sound to him. "Everything I do is related to nature, recognizing the power of nature, which feeds and nourishes us and interacts with it." "How so?" "Long ago, some plants and herbs were identified as having certain medicinal qualities. Some could make you drowsy, or alert, or even heal you, like aloe heals burned skin. What I do is based on that foundation, but extended to include other areas of life, such as emotions, luck, success, fulfillment. Extend that again to other areas of nature, bringing in the four elements: air, fire, water, and Mother Earth. So a diamond aids strength and builds everlasting ties. Laurel promotes fame and victory. Quartz is used to aid concentration." She smiled, touched her hair, and looked away briefly. "A rose facilitates love." "And how do the elements figure into this?" "The elements are the expression of the magic," she said. "In magical grammar, the items, herbs or stones or whatever, are like words, and the elements are the sentence structure. Fire is used in banishings because it burns away whatever it touches." Alex frowned. "Say you had a bad habit you wanted to quit. You would write it on a piece of parchment, then burn it over a flame." "Oh," he said, still slightly confused. "Or water," she said, trying to clarify. "To receive the healing properties of parsley, you would measure the proper dose, grind it to powder, mix it with fresh water, and drink it." "So you're absorbing the magical property because you're drinking it?" "Just like taking a pill," she said with a smile, "except staying in touch with nature instead of the machine that stamped out the pill." She hopped off the bed, opened her cedar chest, and showed him some of her brass candle holders and burner. "I use these when I'm performing incantations," she said, watching his expression intently for signs of disapproval. "Why antiques?" "They were made by hand more than machine, so they're closer to nature than assembly lines. The older, the better." She put everything away and closed the lid of the chest. "Let's go to the basement. Don't worry, no altars down there either." Down in the basement, Wendy didn't comment on the hunting horror of her father's side of the basement, except to ask, "You're not a hunter, are you?" Alex shook his head. "Cool," Wendy said. She bypassed the old frame pyramid and continued onto her desk and wall shelves. She pulled the dividing curtain along its track to isolate her and Alex in her special place. "I keep all my herbs, seeds, flowers, and stones here. Where do you get all this stuff?" "Most of it at the place where I work, a small store in a strip of shops on Thurgey Avenue. It's no Mall of America, I bet," she said. He smiled at her Minneapolis reference. "Some stuff I find on my own. Whatever I buy, I have to consecrate before I use it." She looked through her collection of stones, hidden away in their pouches. She dumped one into her palm. "Here's the tektite stone, used for banishings. And here's a rutilated quartz," she said, showing him a clear stone with streaks like white thread running through it, "for creativity." "Garnet," he said, pointing to a stenciled pouch. "What's that for?" She dumped the deep red stone from its stenciled pouch. "To open yourself to life's pleasures and, sex." "I'll just keep this," he said, pretending to pocket the garnet. Wendy laughed. "Some of the herbs and flowers have properties that duplicate the stones," she said. "Just like rose quartz, parsley, and sage are used for health and healing. She picked up another lettered linen bag. Thyme leaves in your bath water give you courage and strength. Good for an athlete. And here, witch hazel leaves make you charming and irresistible. You must have used those, Alex said, looking right at her. To avoid the intensity of his stare, she looked again at her collection. Let's see. A sprig of rosemary in an infant's room will make him or her safe and happy. And this? He asked, pointing to another pouch. Foxglove? Foxglove leaves, she said, trying to suppress a smile. You have an uncanny knack for picking out certain varieties. She cleared her throat. Keep powdered foxglove leaves in a box at your bedside to open your life to strong sexual love. Alex raised his hands, palms up. I may have a natural gift for picking them out, he said, but you're the one who has them in her collection. She slapped at his hand, laughing. They stared at each other for a moment, neither looking away. Finally, Wendy reached back on the bottom shelf. This is my prize. She withdrew an object wrapped in layers of cloth and laid it in Alex's hands before unwrapping it. Mandrake root, she said. A strong, all-purpose charm. A complete one like this, with the entire man shape, is considered especially powerful. She carefully put it away again. And that concludes our tour. I hope I'm not acting like a tourist, Alex said. Not at all, Wendy said. I hope you understand me better now. God, I hope that didn't sound condescending. I mean, Wendy, I know what you mean, he said. I was the one who acted like some perverted jackass. She touched her fingertips to his lips. Forgotten, she said, except one minor detail. A minor detail? He asked, no doubt wondering at his penance. I need you to do something for me, to help me with something. If you really do understand all this now, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. Yeah, right, she thought. Maybe he thinks I should be locked up for my own protection. The moment he gets out of here, he'll call the men with the straitjackets. I've been having these really intense dreams. They keep me up most of the night, almost every night. And frankly, they scare the hell out of me. She saw no reason to mention that Professor Glazier was having the similar dreams or that she felt somehow responsible for Jack's disappearance. And I can help you? You know the expression, 2 heads are better than one? She asked. Sometimes in magic, 2 are stronger than 1. I've been using magic and homeopathic remedies to help me, but I think I need to up the ante against these dreams, to get control of my sleep, to get control of my life again. Are you trying to tell me this involves you and me in a magic circle? Yes. And we'd be, naked, of course. It works better that way, she said, smiling. A wide grin. So what's the downside? This may sound kinky to you, she said, but it's serious to me. She almost said deadly serious, but that would be definitely put him over the edge. The downside for me is that it might not work, but I really need to try. I want you to be as serious about this as I am. If it's a dirty joke to you, it won't work. Magic rituals are all about a state of mind. So if I do this and take it seriously, then you'll believe me about understanding it all? It would sure help your case, young man, she said and grinned. She was using her leverage unfairly, but it was merely a hint of her desperation. He needed enough wiggle room to feel he could decline without hurting her feelings. Do you think you can approach it with an open mind? He thought for a moment, sighed, and said, I think so. Good, she said, kissing him again. But this was more than a thank you kiss. It was a kiss filled with possibilities. With her hands light around his neck and his hands around her waist, she could almost feel safe. She could almost hope. How long do I have to think about it? She dropped her hands, stepped back, breathed deeply. Till nightfall. Come back when the moon is high. Let's say 8:30ish. Tonight? He asked, stunned. You're talking about tonight? Unless you have other plans. And it's time for some more coffee.